Here are the topics that will be covered in the President's revision video. This video is going to focus on how to compare the two executive branches. Starting with looking at the roles and powers of the UK Prime Minister and the US President. When we look at the Chief Executive, the UK PM and US President are each Chief Executive of their own government, so are responsible for running their respective countries. However, there is a very different importance in the type of executive power that they hold. The President is a singular executive, so has sole executive authority, whereas the PM heads a collective executive and shares power with cabinet members, who hold collective responsibility for all cabinet decisions. The President has greater power than the Prime Minister, including the ability to use direct authority to issue executive orders, executive agreements, and signing arrangements. Then there is the head of state role. In the US, the President is the head of state, whereas in the UK, this role is performed by the monarch. The US President therefore receives the type of ceremony and pageantry that is reserved for the monarch in the UK. Also, as part of their role and powers, we can look at legislation. Both leaders initiate legislation within their respective legislatives, but the US separation of powers means that the President's powers are significantly more limited in this area. Congress is separate from the executive and therefore develops its own programme of legislation. The President can suggest legislation to Congress, but it may be rejected. In the UK, the executive is part of the legislative. As a result, the government's programme of legislation receives the vast majority of parliamentary time. In addition, the UK's parliamentary democracy allows the Prime Minister more opportunities to influence voting in legislation, provided that their party has a majority in the House of Commons. Prime Ministers can use their position as party leader to influence MPs from their party. The whip system helps to ensure party discipline. A Prime Minister with a sizable majority and strong support from their party enjoys a position so strong that it has been described as an elective dictatorship. There are few checks and balances on the UK government's ability to pass legislation. Parliament is sovereign, so the UK Supreme Court cannot strike down its laws, whereas the US Supreme Court can rule laws as unconstitutional. The House of Lords can only delay legislation for up to a year, unlike in the US where the Senate can block it entirely. Still looking at legislation, we have the separation of powers, which limits the President's control of party discipline. House and Senate whips work for party leadership of those chambers rather than the President. A Prime Minister with a large majority generally finds it much easier to deliver their legislative agenda. However, the President does have the ability to veto legislation, which the Prime Minister does not. If Parliament passes legislation of which the Prime Minister disapproves, it becomes law regardless. This has occurred in September 2019 when the European Union Withdrawal Act was forced by Boris Johnson's government to seek an extension to the UK's withdrawal from the EU. Also part of their roles and powers is financial powers. Congress must approve the President's budget each year. The agreement is often difficult to achieve and requires significant compromises. Occasional government shutdowns are a dramatic illustration of the limits of presidential power. In the UK, government shutdowns do not happen, as it is much easier for the Prime Minister to pass their budget. UK governments usually hold a majority in the House of Commons, so have the votes required. Minority governments are rare and generally receive enough votes from other parties to pass their budget, or to make necessary changes to the budget to avoid rejection and a vote of no confidence. Finally, as part of the roles and powers of the UK Prime Minister and President, we have military powers. The President is Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, where in the UK the monarch formally performs this role. However, the PM acts as the overall military decision-maker, just as the President does. The PM can declare war using royal prerogative power, the power to take action using royal authority, although again this is formally done by the monarch. Unlike the PM, the President cannot declare war, as this is done by Congress. However, neither country has made a formal declaration of war since World War II, so their use of military action is more significant. The War Powers Act of 1973 places a legal requirement on the President to seek approval of Congress for military action, although presidents do not always adhere to this. In contrast, there is no legal need for the Prime Minister to consult Parliament before committing troops. Some argue that a constitutional convention of parliamentary approval has emerged since 2003, when the Parliament supported the UK involvement in the Iraq War. In 2013, Parliament voted against David Cameron's planned military action in Syria. However, military action was taken in Libya in 2011 and Mali in 2013, without a preceding vote. Then we have appointments. The President's appointments to the executive branch positions require the Senate confirmation, whereas the UK's PM can appoint whoever they choose. However, the President has the right to nominate federal judges. These need Senate approval, but give the President influence over the judiciary that the UK PM lacks. Then we've got elections. The US President is directly elected, so has a personal mandate. The UK Prime Minister is the leader of whichever political party is able to form a government. Their authority comes from leading the largest party in the House of Commons, which in turn has a mandate from the last general election. Prime Ministers therefore do not need an individual mandate. Indeed, a Prime Minister who takes over between general elections has not faced the electorate as a potential Prime Minister, as was the case for Johnson from July 2019 until the general election in December of that year. Then we have term limits. The PM has no term limit. The US Constitution prevents the President from being elected for more than 2 terms. This weakens the power of the President in his final years of their second term. The longest serving modern PM was Margaret Thatcher, who served for 11 years and 208 days. Prime Ministerial support power tends to decrease towards the end of their term in office, particularly as support from their party and the public begins to wane. But Prime Ministers do not have a clear endpoint as US Presidents do. Then we have succession. The US Constitution states a line of succession in which the Vice President automatically succeeds the President if the latter dies or resigns or is removed from office. Presidential candidates choose a running mate for presidential elections, and the successful pair are elected together. If the VP resigns, dies, or becomes president, a candidate for the vacant position is chosen by the President and is confirmed by both houses of Congress. In the UK, the PM may choose to appoint a deputy, but this is not a constitutional requirement. Johnson did not have a deputy PM when he was hospitalised with COVID-19 in 2020, so the Secretary of State Dominic Raab deputised for him. A deputy may also stand in during Prime Minister's questions, but it is unlikely to succeed as leader. The PM is succeeded by whoever leads the party with the most support in the House of Commons, following an internal leadership election or a general election. Continuing to look at roles and powers of the UK Prime Minister and the US President, let's start by looking at patronage. The PM and the President can both reward supporters with cabinet or government positions. This power of patronage is more useful to the PM as it increases their influence over Parliament, where they can depend on the loyalty of the payroll vote. The separation of powers prevents the President from influencing members of Congress in this way. The PM can recommend supporters for life peerages or honours. Life peerages allow Prime Ministers to directly influence the composition of the House of Lords, although appointees may act independently if they choose. Honours give the recipients a medal or either a knighthood or admission to a different order of chivalry, such as an MBE, which is similar to presidential awards such as the Presidential Medal of Freedom. We also have the power of the pardon. The power of the pardon is held by the President and is used widely. In the UK, the monarch can issue a royal pardon on the advice of the Justice Secretary, although this is very rare. A high-profile example of this was the 2013 posthumous pardon of Second World War codebreaker Alan Turing for homosexual indecency in 1952. A big argument that often comes up is who has the greater power, the President or the Prime Minister. Let's start by looking at the powers that the President has. The President is the head of state and head of government, and they are the sole head of the executive branch. They also have a much larger bureaucracy to support them, such as the Exarch. The President is also the Commander-in-Chief of the US military and cannot be removed during a term of office except by impeachment. This contrasts with the House of Commons, who can bring down a Prime Minister's government through a vote of no confidence for any reason at any time. The USA's position as the world's largest economic and military power also gives the President huge international influence. Let's compare this then to the Prime Minister. A Prime Minister with a large majority and good party discipline can have great power and even an elective dictatorship. The Prime Minister can use the whip system and powers of patronage to dominate MPs from their party. Prime Minister does not require approval for their cabinet appointments and is less restricted by checks and balances compared to the President. There is also no legal requirement for the Prime Minister to obtain Parliament's permission for military action, and they do not have term limits, so can continue in office for much longer. We then need to look at accountability to the legislatives. First, we need to look at this in terms of passing legislation. Both leaders introduce their annual legislative agenda to their legislatives. The President makes a State of Union address to Congress, and the monarch delivers the Queen's speech on behalf of the government at the state opening of Parliament. Presidents generally find it more difficult to pass legislation through Congress, particularly during the periods of divided government. Members of Congress are less subservient to their party leadership than MPs and are more critical of legislation, which can often lead to gridlock. The President's relationship with Congress can be challenging, even during periods of united government. In 2017, Trump failed to repeal Obamacare in his first 100 days. His bill was defeated by 4 Republican senators who declared they would vote against it. However, the President has the power to veto legislation passed by Congress, and it is difficult for Congress to modify its legislation in line with the President's demands. The PM has no veto power, but is less likely to be faced with legislation that they do not support. The vast majority of parliamentary legislative time is given to government bills. The PM only has to convince one chamber to support their legislation, the House of Commons, in which the PM generally has the majority. The UK PM therefore rarely faces a divided government. Continuing on with passing legislation, PMs can generally use the whip system to ensure party discipline on government legislation. MPs are pressured to toe the party line by the threat of deselection or career stagnation. Presidents have to make more deals and work harder to convince members of Congress to support them. During periods of minority government, however, the PM may also struggle to get legislation through Parliament. Theresa May failed to pass her EU withdrawal bill through Parliament, which led to her resignation. Even PMs with a majority can find it difficult to get their way in Parliament if they do not have tight party discipline. For example, John Major's premiership was hampered by divisions and rebellions within his own party over Europe. However, these situations occur less frequently in UK politics than in the USA. We also have, when looking at accountability to the legislative, the scrutiny of the executive. Both legislators use the committee system to scrutinise government. However, the Prime Minister is personally held to account by the House of Commons at the weekly Prime Minister's questions and also speaks at key debates in the Commons. The separation of powers means that the President does not address Congress other than during the presidential annual State of the Union speech and occasional special joint sessions of Congress relating to specific issues of national importance. We also have removal from office. The House of Commons can call a vote of no confidence in the government at any time. This can be for any reason, including simply that the Prime Minister and the government are not performing well. A simply majority vote is enough to remove the PM and the government from office. Prime Ministers may also be forced to resign by their party when it becomes clear that they do not command enough support in the House of Commons to govern effectively, but before a vote of no confidence is called. It is much more difficult for Congress to remove the President from office as it must navigate the complex process of the impeachment for wrongdoing. No President has ever been found guilty by the Senate and removed from office, although 3 have been impeached by the House, twice in Trump's case. Another area that you can compare the 2 executive branches is the relationship of the UK Prime Minister and the US President to other institutions. Let's start by looking at Cabinet. The Prime Minister and the President both select their cabinet members, but there are a number of key differences in their relationship with their cabinets. Let's start by looking at the US. The President's cabinet nominees need a Senate confirmation, whereas Prime Ministers can appoint whoever they like. The President does not share executive authority with cabinet officers, whereas the Prime Minister is primus inter pares in a system of collective cabinet government. US cabinet officers are not political rivals of the President. Cabinet is the ultimate decision-making body in the UK. Under a collective cabinet responsibility, Minster must publicly support government policy or resign. Cabinet officers tend to be policy specialists in the US, whereas cabinet ministers are often the Prime Minister's political rivals and are given certain areas. Cabinet officers tend to stay in the same department for a really long time, whereas UK cabinet members are not policy specialists and often move around quite frequently. Cabinet reshuffles in the US are not used to increase the President's control of their party, whereas in the UK, cabinet reshuffles are used in a form of patronage and control. The US Cabinet has no power to threaten the President's position other than invoking the 25th Amendment, which has never happened, whereas the Prime Minister can fall from power if they lose the support of their Cabinet. The President may only call a handful of Cabinet meetings in a year, so the relevance of Cabinet isn't that high, whereas Cabinet meetings are held frequently in the UK, often weekly. We also have the relationship with the executive administration. Both leaders receive considerable administrative support to help them run their governments. The scale and scope of the EXOP, though, is much more extensive than the Prime Minister's office and the Cabinet's office. And lastly, we have wider bureaucracy. Both leaders act as chief executive for the whole government bureaucracy. The President heads the federal government and federal agencies, and the Prime Minister controls the civil service and government agencies. The vast majority of top officials in the UK civil service do not change from one government to the next, although a number of special advisors who are important political appointees do. In contrast, a new US government administration needs to fill around 4,000 government positions. The character of the federal government's senior staff is fundamentally changed from one administration to the next, with a steep learning curve for many staff appointed at the start of the President's first term.